Donald Trump sat in the back of a black Cadillac Escalade, slowly rolling through the busy traffic of Manhattan. The lights flickered through the tinted windows, neon signs, headlights, and reflections of rain on the wet asphalt. An intense silence filled the cabin, broken only by the steady hum of the engine. 5 minutes, the driver dryly announced over the intercom. Trump leaned back in his seat, tapping his fingers on the armrest. He had been waiting for this interview with barely concealed tension. The channel he had agreed to speak with was known for its liberal views, and he knew this wouldn't be an easy conversation. But he needed this interview. The previous elections had shown that he was losing support in certain states, and among independent voters, his positions had weakened. He ran his hand through his perfectly styled golden hair. The doors opened, and a cold gust of wind hit his face. The cameras flashed, journalists shouted, but security quickly formed a living wall, and Trump calmly headed towards the studio entrance. At the round table in the studio, Emma Wright, a young, determined journalist with a piercing gaze and a reputation for being a tough interviewer, was already seated. She had publicly criticized Trump several times and had asked him uncomfortable questions at press conferences. Trump sat across from her, never taking his eyes off her. The director signaled, and the camera began recording. "Mr. Trump," Emma began with a slight smile. "Thank you for agreeing to this conversation. I'm always happy to talk to the press, even though I know you're not going to be kind to me," Trump replied with a barely noticeable irony. "I just want the truth." Emma leaned slightly forward, her gaze darkening. "Let's start with the main issue, your immigration policy. In recent weeks, there have been many reports about deportations and family separations. How do you explain this?" Trump maintained a calm expression. "I'm doing what's necessary to protect the country. The law is the law. If you break the rules, you have to face the consequences." "But what about the children who are left without parents?" Emma sharply interrupted. "Their lives are being destroyed. Do you understand that?" "It's the responsibility of their parents, not the government," Trump answered, leaning forward and looking her directly in the eye. Emma smiled faintly. She had expected exactly that response. "And do you realize that due to your policy, over 5,000 children are currently in temporary detention centers? Some of them are being held in cages." "That's a lie." "These are the facts," Emma's voice raised. "We have documentary evidence. And people want to know, how are you going to fix this?" Trump paused, staring into her eyes. "I'm doing what's right for the country," he repeated. Emma glanced at the producer behind the camera, who gestured for her to continue. "And what about the accusations of abuse of power? Several former White House employees have publicly stated that you personally pressured officials to change the results of investigations into your business." "Lies," Trump coldly responded. "Do you have any proof?" "Do you?" Emma tensed but didn't look away. "So you deny all the accusations?" "I deny the manipulation of facts and the falsification of information that the media is currently spreading." Trump's voice became sharp, almost metallic. "And what about the middle-class people who lost their jobs due to your economic policies? Do you think they're happy with how you're running the country?" Trump pressed his lips together, his face remaining impassive. "People are always unhappy when they have to go through changes. So you think that 20% unemployment is just changes?" "These are temporary difficulties," Trump replied. Emma crossed her arms over her chest. "And you truly believe that justifies? If you want to hear the truth, listen. If you want to shout, I can leave." Trump's voice was firm but calm. Emma wanted to continue, but Trump raised his hand. "If you want to hear the truth, let me answer, and don't attack." Silence fell in the studio. All eyes were on them. Emma took a breath, trying to hold herself together. "All right, go ahead." People want to see strength in leadership. They want to know that their interests are being protected. If I sometimes make unpopular decisions, it's because I think about the future of this country. Emma felt her palms grow sweaty. She realized he knew how to keep the situation under control. Then, a voice came through the earpiece. "The producer says we have 5 more minutes. Try to push him." Emma tensed. "Mr. Trump," she said, "why do you always avoid direct answers?" Trump smiled slightly at the corner of his mouth. "I answer directly. You just don't want to hear the answer." Emma felt her jaw clench. "So maybe it's time to say something people want to hear?" Trump leaned in closer. "Or maybe it's time for people to hear the truth, even if they don't like it." The silence became almost palpable. The silence in the room grew tense, like a taut string. Reporters exchanged quick glances, waiting for the next move. Trump stood motionless, his gaze cold and piercing. He slowly descended from the podium and approached Julia, who now stood with her head held high, but her eyes burned with tension. "I've already answered your question." Trump's voice was low and decisive. "Did you not understand?" "I understood, Mr. President." Julia forced herself to speak firmly, though her heart was pounding in her chest. "But your words contradict the facts. You want us to simply accept your version of events, even when the evidence says otherwise." A low murmur filled the room. Someone from the press nervously chuckled, but most remained frozen in anticipation. Trump narrowed his eyes slightly. "Are you referring to fake evidence?" He stepped closer, and Julia felt his shadow fall over her. "I'm referring to real testimonies from people who have suffered because of your decisions." Her voice grew sharper. "You can call it a lie, but the numbers don't lie." Trump leaned in closer, so much that Julia felt his breath on her face. "Are you sure about that?" he whispered, a hint of threat in his voice. Julia swallowed the lump in her throat, but didn't back down. "Absolutely." "Security." Trump abruptly stepped back, his face freezing into an icy mask. 2 guards in dark suits immediately began moving toward Julia. "Stop," someone from the crowd shouted. "This is a press conference," another reporter yelled. The guards grabbed Julia by the arms, and she felt herself being pulled out of the room. She struggled, but their grip was ironclad. "This is a violation of free speech," someone from the crowd cried. "This is tyranny," another person stood up from their seat. Trump turned back to the podium, a cold smile spreading across his face. "This is what happens when people think they know more than I do," he said, as though nothing had happened. "Next question." Julia was escorted down a long marble-floored corridor and was released near a set of massive doors with golden handles. "You'd better leave the building," one of the guards said, his voice devoid of emotion. "And if I don't?" she summoned the courage to ask. The guard didn't respond, he just took a step back. Julia ran her hand through her hair, trying to calm the trembling in her hands. Trump's words echoed in her head. "Are you sure about that?" She knew she couldn't leave it like this. "I'll be back," she muttered under her breath, heading toward the exit. She had no idea that someone was already waiting for her outside the doors. Julia stepped into the narrow corridor, where the dim lights barely flickered. The echo of her footsteps spread through the cold walls. She felt her heart pounding wildly in her chest, but she forced herself to walk forward, not looking back. "Miss Gray, where's the rush?" She heard a familiar male voice from the shadows. Julia spun around sharply. Against the wall, submerged in semi-darkness, stood a man in a gray suit. Tall, thin, with sharp features and piercing eyes that gleamed in the dark. She recognized him immediately. It was Richard Hall, the president's advisor, always at the center of political intrigues. "Were you waiting for me?" Julia tried to make her voice sound calm, but there was an underlying tension. Richard took a step forward, and the light touched his face, emphasizing the predatory curve of his lips. "I'd say I've been waiting for this moment," he smiled slightly. "You don't think they'll just let you put the president in such a position without consequences?" Julia pressed her lips together. "If he wants to get rid of me, let him try." Her eyes flashed with defiance. "Oh, he doesn't want to get rid of you." "At least not yet." Richard stepped closer, and his voice became softer, almost gentle. "In fact, he's even interested in you." In your skills. My skills. Julia took a step back. Richard tilted his head, his eyes narrowing. Of course. You're smart, quick, fearless. People like you are rare in our business. The president thinks you could be useful. And what am I supposed to do? Pretend everything's fine while he hides the truth. Julia clenched her fists. No, Richard smiled, and something cold, almost beastly, appeared in his grin. You're supposed to help us find the weak points in your colleagues. Those who dig too deep. Is this blackmail? A frosty edge appeared in Julia's voice. This is an offer. Richard stopped just a step away from her. Think about it, Julia. You could be inside the system, have access to information, or stay on the outside, and become a target. She stared into his eyes, trying to gauge how far he was willing to go. What if I refuse? Richard sighed and ran a hand through his hair. Then I'm afraid the next article in your newspaper will be your last. And not even because you'll be fired. Julia felt a chill run down her spine. What are you trying to say? Richard grinned wider. My dear, not all secrets come to light. And those that do often hide consequences. Julia took a step back, but he instantly grabbed her wrist. Think about it, Julia. His fingers tightened around her hand, and she felt his nails digging into her skin. We all want the same thing, control. You can be on the side of those who control, or become just another pawn on the board. Let go of me, Julia said quietly, but there was steel in her voice. Richard released her hand, but his eyes never left hers. You have 3 days to make a decision. Julia stood in the semi-darkness, watching as Richard slowly retreated down the corridor. She knew that in 3 days, her life would change forever. And if she made the wrong decision, it could be the end for her. Julia stood in the hallway for a few more seconds, until Richard's footsteps dissolved into the silence. Her wrist still ached from his grip, and her mind was in turmoil. She took a deep breath and quickly headed for her office. When the door closed behind her, she leaned against it and closed her eyes. 3 days. He had given her 3 days to make a decision. But what decision did she really have? Either she becomes a tool in the hands of the system, or they'll destroy her. She sat at her desk and opened her laptop. Her fingers trembled as she typed in the password. After opening the encrypted file, Julia reread everything she had uncovered over the past months. Financial transactions, hidden connections between the president and several multinational corporations, the disappearance of political opponents. It was pure dynamite. A knock on the door. Julia abruptly raised her head. Who's there? It's me, Liam. Open up, came the voice from behind the door. She approached and opened it. Liam, her colleague and once her closest friend, stood in the doorway. His dark hair was tousled, and his eyes were alert. We need to talk, he said quietly, stepping inside. What happened? Liam shut the door and moved closer. Do you really think you can publish this information? Julia pressed her lips together. What do you mean? I know what you found. He looked at her with a serious expression. I know you're digging under the president. Julia felt everything inside tighten. You've been watching me. No, but it's not just me who knows. Liam nervously ran a hand through his hair. They know too, Julia. Richard. He came to see me this morning. Julia felt her heart skip a beat. What did he say? He said that if I don't help him keep an eye on you, I'll have to answer for my past mistakes. Liam gave a bitter smile. They know everything. About the recordings, about funding the opposition through front funds. Julia stepped closer, her eyes narrowing. And what did you tell them? That I'll think about it. Liam met her gaze. But it's a trap, Julia. They're going to try to use both of us. Julia felt her blood boil with anger. Damn it. They want us to betray each other. Exactly. Liam leaned in closer and whispered, Do you have a plan? Julia paused for a moment. She glanced at the laptop, then at Liam. If they want to play a game with us, we'll respond in kind. Her voice turned cold, and there was steel in her gaze. What are you planning? Julia sat down at her desk and quickly opened another file, the one stored in a protected folder called Backup. They think I only have this data on the president. But there's something else, something they don't even suspect. Liam leaned closer, trying to see the screen. What is it? Julia looked at him, her eyes gleaming with cold determination. Richard's phone call recordings. Liam froze. You're kidding. No, Julia smiled. If they want to play with me, I'll play first. But how did you get this? Julia looked at him calmly. I had my sources. Now the question is, are you ready to take the risk with me? Liam was silent for a few seconds, then clenched his jaw and nodded. To the end. Julia slammed the laptop shut and stood up. All right, then let's begin. She approached the door and opened it. Richard was standing in the hallway. Julia, he smiled with his predatory grin. Made a decision? Julia threw him a cold glance. Yes, but now the terms are changing. Richard squinted. This is interesting. What are the new terms? Julia took a step forward, her voice sharp as a knife. You no longer control the situation, Richard. Now I do. His face tensed, but he didn't respond. Soon everyone will know the truth. Not just about the president, Julia smiled, but also about you. Richard tilted his head, his eyes narrowing. Be careful, Julia. You don't know who you're dealing with. Oh, I do. Her smile grew even colder. The question is, are you ready for the consequences? He stood there for a second longer, then retreated into the shadows. We'll talk again. I don't doubt it, Julia said as the door closed behind him. Liam approached her. What now? Julia looked at the closed door, her eyes gleaming with defiance. Now we go on the offensive. Julia stood in the hallway for a few more seconds after Richard left. Liam stepped closer. Are you sure this is the right move? His voice was quiet but tense. Julia turned to him. Her face was as hard as steel. We've already gone too far to back down. She opened her laptop and entered the command. The file with Richard's recordings began to upload to a secure cloud storage. If anything goes wrong, she said without taking her eyes off the screen, these recordings will go to all the leading media outlets. Are you sure they'll react? Liam leaned over her shoulder, watching the upload. When journalists hear Richard blackmailing judges, orchestrating disappearances, and making deals with the president about elections, they won't be able to ignore it. But they might come after you. Liam frowned. Julia smiled a cold smile. Let them try. She clicked send. The upload finished. The files were now beyond her control and beyond Richard's. It's done, she said. The way back is closed. Liam moved to the window and looked outside. The car. They're already here. Julia joined him. In the black sedan near the entrance sat Richard. His silhouette was barely visible through the tinted glass, but Julia knew he was watching them. They won't stop, Liam said quietly. I know, Julia gritted her teeth. The sedan moved off and slowly drove down the street. This is a warning, Liam said. Julia stepped away from the window. This was his last chance. The next morning, Julia sat on the couch in her apartment when her phone buzzed. She picked it up and saw notifications from major news channels. Scandal in the government. Massive corruption exposed at the highest levels. Recordings confirm blackmail and manipulations by the president. Administration head Richard Wester at the center of the scandal. Julia smiled faintly. She raised the phone to her ear and dialed the number. Is that you? Liam's voice came through. They took the bait, Julia said. Do you think Richard will go all the way? He has no choice. Her voice turned cold. And what's next? Julia walked to the window and looked down at the street. Richard's sedan was no longer there. We won the first round. But this game has only just begun. She hung up the phone and took a deep breath. Silence filled the room, but Julia could feel the new threat pulsing in the air. She knew Richard wouldn't give up easily. But now the advantage was on her side. She looked at her reflection in the window and confidently said to herself, "Now I'm the hunter,